Welcome to Written and Said, where we try to figure out what Foucault was talking about. So let's start at the very beginning. 1949. Foucault is 23 years old, studying at the Sorbonne under Jean Hippolyte, and he's just submitted his thesis, The Constitution of a Historical Transcendental in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. It's something of a half-book report and half-interpretation. It's divided into three parts, roughly the truth, the subject, and history. Foucault attempts to distinguish two forms of objectivity. On one hand, we have an unbiased subjectivity, a subjectivity that is objective by virtue of being an ideal void. And on the other hand, we have an objectivity that is nature, a nature without subjectivity, that is destined and without freedom. But for Hegel, neither exist. There's no such thing as the ideal void of the subject, no such thing as a nature without subjectivity. And rather, there is a constant oscillation. Objectivity reduced to a destiny, subjectivity as a union with objectivity. Examples will appear in later works, the idea being that when wandering around in the world, sometimes you can identify a stage that is just beckoning you to come and speak, a sort of role to occupy. We also need to distinguish a few flavors of truth. For example, truth is not so much a domain, as in Kant. One is not in the true or in the false. But nor, like in Fichte, is truth internal to the system, excluding consciousness. Rather, for Hegel, there is a passage from truth to certainty that requires subjectivity. Thus, truth appears as a sort of a limit, a sort of entering into a transcendental book of this march towards science. And thus, phenomenology appears, not just as a method, but as a result that flowed from the system. And it should be noted here that what we're interested in is not so much a pneumonology, but rather we're going to stay on the side of consciousness. Not talking about the emptiness of a pure subject, but the knowledge of a constituted world. And ultimately, the scandal is that the transcendental is not so much the abstract, the ideal of our messy reality, but it is already lived experience. The transcendental is present as medium of knowledge. Now, having defined a notion of objectivity, less as a division between truth and illusion, and more as an experience of an objective world, we can move on to the notion of the transcendental subject. Foucault argues that in an early Hegel, we see a traditional division in the notion of life. On one hand, we have the totality of all living things, and on the other, we have something that resists totality, escaping totalization. But in Hegel, this relationship becomes dialectical. Through a series of realizations, we understand that subjectivity, and its freedom of reflection, becomes objectivity, bound to a destiny. Life is no longer a totalizing principle, but rather a figure of consciousness and dialectic. When a consciousness recognizes that life is in peril, life itself will spring forth from the immobile world of objects. A couple important things to note here. First, as noticed by Christophe Bouton, we seem to have Foucault's first reference to the notion of man as an empirico-transcendental doublet. As recognition of a world is necessarily empirical, but is accomplished through subjective reflection as transcendental activity. Also, that what man experiences is not so much the natural being there, but experience is an experience of one's own knowledge. In later works, Foucault will analogize this to the stage, where one can ask of the representation of the divine. Who is doing the representation? Is the divine representing itself? Is this representation a report, or is it an assertion? There's no explicit reference to Elizabeth Anscombe's notion of the direction of fit, but the idea seems to be the same. Ultimately, we can distinguish Hegel from Kant. In Kant's synthesis, is truth as a reward, but ultimately there is no effect on the world. Whereas in Hegel, representations are our effect. Thus, subjectivity can be both the element and the constitutive principle of this world. So let's take a moment to define this transcendental subject. This cogito in Hegel, Foucault will contrast it with that of Descartes and Kant. In Descartes, I think, is what we use to infer the I am. Being is introduced, but only as an inference. In Kant, it is also an empty I think, a pure function. Truth may be a reward at the end of a synthesis, but there is no effect. That is, whereas in Kant it's a pure function without relation to the content of experience, Hegel characterizes this as an actual relation, that is, as an effectful relation. Under this model, where the subject is stateful and where it can receive impressions, the problem becomes one of showing how I know can effectively found all knowledge. And here, in a culture where God has become obsolete, Hegel will resort to a unity of thought and being, that is, a realization in concrete reality of the universal and the particular. In later works, Foucault will show how Nietzsche challenges this universality. But for now, let's focus on two aspects. On one hand, this seems to put us firmly in the realm of intentional type theory, a sort of propositions as types. And on the other hand, Hegel seems to confer an effectiveness on representations which make a world. That is, the representations that make up a world are the effect of a subject. For Hegel, the subject is both real and transcendental, in that it completes and sums up a culture. It is this passage from self-consciousness to self-consciousness of a world. We come to a question of the status of the philosopher and the role of language and expression. Before covering what this means for the subject, what challenges this presents for the subject, let's speak a little bit more about this world, which is on one hand transcendental and universal, and on the other hand empirical and particular. Here's where Foucault's pedigree comes into play. We see that Hippolyte was somewhat of an intuitionist, a very French version of Dummett, or today we might point to Père Martin Loff, whose theories serve as a basis for many programming languages today. These are the programming languages that are statically typed, where one can apply a maxim, propositions, as types. The idea being that we make our claims in the type signature, our propositions that need proofs, and by exhibiting an implementation, we have satisfied a proof. If I claim I've got an integer, I must show you a 1 or a 2. And we can say that these values are expressions of the underlying type integer. Things get more interesting as types get more complex. An integer can represent an age, for example, and we can combine simple types into complex types, such as a person, with an age and a name. An example more relevant to Hegel might be the type that represents a cup of coffee with optional milk, and another with optional cream. There are also types that represent effects. For example, a type that represents a stateful world that receives impressions. But the principle is the same. The claims we make ahead of time, transcendentally, we might say, whereas the values are checked empirically. And we can see how the types correspond to words at the transcendental level, and the expressions correspond to our representations of an empirical level. And in this sense, the types correspond to words, the types being the general thing, instantiated by an expression, the specific thing in the real world. And in this way, we naturalize language. On one hand, we can recognize these expressions as constructions in the world, and on the other hand, we can assert these constructions and contest a world of our own. If representation is an effect of the subject, then their world is their project. And it is this notion of language as the expression of a transcendental that Foucault will find in Hegel. He'll contrast this with a traditional notion of language as an alienation from thought, and will use it as an example Diderot's the Rameau's nephew. The problem then becomes one of sorting out this great noise of mixing voices. Only Hegel will see in this a double transcendence, not only vertically, ascending towards universality, but also horizontally, traversing historically, something like we ourselves offering the proof of Fermat's last theorem. Ultimately for Hegel, language is the word with a capital W. Language is the being there of the spirit, and language is the instrument of reason. Now, having defined the notion of truth and objectivity, and also the notion of a transcendental subject, we've come to the third part, the notion of transcendental history. First, we must distinguish the time of history and the time of consciousness. That is, before Hegel, philosophies of time were deployed outside any historical perspective. We have something of a divine providence, which manifested itself in history, and the notion of man, who could not break through the screen of everyday time and rise into his eternity of wisdom. And whereas Kant and Herder seem to maintain this division between time and history, Hegel says we must recognize a certain perpetual and absolutely unlimited progress of the universe, so that it always advances towards a greater civilization. That is, before Hegel, the philosophies of time were deployed outside of any historical perspective. History was not something that was human. It was a concern that belonged to God alone, in which man had to recognize his destiny. For Hegel, what is important is that we follow the movement of self-consciousness, since the spirit is what follows the course of world history. We thus come to the notion of history in phenomenology. On one hand, it is limited by the rational and necessary march of a spirit which develops in the life of the universe. On the other hand, it is essential that there is a consciousness that thinks it. It is in this subjective realization of history, this oscillation between subjective reflection and objective realization. It is a vision that is one and the same thing with what it aims at. Through a process reminiscent of the comedy of errors, lived time is identified with history. At once we recognize the freedom to adopt this role and the alienation of the objectification. In this way, Hegel totalizes history, consciousness, and the world. So, when it comes to absolute knowledge in history, for Hegel, the philosopher is the one that stands above history, the one for whom the world has meaning. Yet Hegel does not remain outside of the system and detached. He integrates himself into it as the last stone in the edifice. Hegel has not stopped time, nor replaced God, but has simply moved to a higher level of investigation, from beyond history to meaning, from beyond the origin of events to the origin in religion. Yet this position of transcendental subject has been acquired. In Hegel's jargon, we have on one hand the in itself, the not yet known, and on the other hand the for itself, which is grasped by consciousness. But if consciousness is consciousness of historical meaning, then it must be in a language that is for us. That is, it must have a meaning for the we. That is, through the effects of knowledge, this we, which we have seen was initially the ideal consciousness, ends up revealing itself as being the transcendental subject. At this point, we reach the final chapter, an objection raised by Marx. Since this has all happened in the head of Hegel, isn't this compromised by the worst of subjectivities? At what point can we have an objective history? And so we return once again to this notion of oscillation between subjectivity and objectivity, and this resolution of a comedy of errors. It's not so much that subjectivity totalizes the truth, but rather that objectivity is being one with the truth. On one hand, a subjective projection, on the other hand, a sacrifice to universal objectivity. Therefore, the postulate on which these objections of Marx are based are erroneous. It is not possible to interpret the transcendental self in only a subjectivist sense. And in conclusion, the entire phenomenology of spirit can be interpreted as the phenomenology of a philosophical consciousness, and the description of this march towards integral knowledge.